Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States. Hi. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to the William G. McGowan Theater, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us by YouTube today. Today, our guest is a man with some dangerous ideas about some of the major issues of the day, such as First Amendment rights, taxes, the court's role in interpreting laws, economics, and conspiracy theories. Whether you agree with him or not, you'll probably leave here today thinking about some of these things. Before we get to today's guest, I'd like to tell you about several programs coming up this week in this theater. On Wednesday, September 10th at noon, our guest will be historian Edward Baptist, who will discuss his book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. In his book, Baptist discusses how the expansion of slavery in the earliest decades of this nation drove the evolution and modernization of the United States. The South grew to become a cotton empire, and the United States grew into a modern industrial and capitalist economy, trying to find ways to make slavery more profitable. A book signing will follow this program. And on Friday, September 12th at noon, our guest will be Lynn Cheney, former chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities. She will discuss her latest book, James Madison, A Life Reconsidered. Madison is often called the father of the Constitution, and his views, as presented in the Federalist Papers, help shape the nation we live in today, and a book signing will follow that program also. To learn more about these and all of our programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies in the lobby, as well as sign-up sheets. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our exhibit and program activities, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. Cass Sunstein is the Robert Walmsley University professor and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at the Harvard Law School. After a distinguished career at the University of Chicago in both the political science department and law school, Cass was nominated to head the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. Nominated in January 2009 and finally confirmed in September of that year. And if you want to get an up-close and personal look of what that confirmation looks like, check out Cass's book, Simpler. OIRA is a federal office established by Congress in the 1980 Paperwork Reduction Act and is part of the Office of Management and Budget. And their mandate was expanded during the Clinton administration to enhance planning and coordination with respect to both new and existing regulations, to restore integrity and legitimacy of the regulatory review and oversight process, and to make the process more accessible and open to the public. And it is accessibility and openness which was the hallmark of Cass's time at OIRA, supporting this administration's concerted efforts to promote transparency and open government. On a personal note, Cass was one of the first people in the administration I met with as I was preparing for my own confirmation hearing. He clearly saw the National Archives as a player in the administration's Open Government Initiative and as the guiding force behind the President's Memorandum on Records Management, which makes the point that you can't have open government with good records. Cass left his OIRA position in 2012 to return to teaching and research at Harvard, and last August was tapped by President Obama to serve on the Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technology. Cass is a prolific author. After the Rights Revolution, Risk and Reason Knowledge, Republic.com 2.0, Worst Case Scenarios, Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, On Rumors, How Falsehoods Spread, Why We Believe Them, What Can Be Done, What Can Be Done. Simpler, where Cass shares the three most important things he learned during his time in the White House, and now Conspiracy Theories and Other Dangerous Ideas. Described by Glenn Beck as the most dangerous man in America, Cass's new book is a compilation of 11 controversial thought pieces published in academic journals, which earned him that title. From animal rights to laws of happiness, from new progressivism to minimalism, from conspiracy theories to trimming and more. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Cass Sunstein.
Well, thank you so much for coming. Special thanks to David, who has done a phenomenal job serving the United States and open government and really good records management, as we often have thought and said, is the backbone of open government. And there's actually a connection between that and my topic today. So really hats off to what happens under his watch. I'll tell you the origins of this, in some ways, unlikely project. In Colorado a few years ago, I worked with some colleagues to try to figure out what happens when people talk to each other. And what we did was we got people in Colorado Springs, which is a pretty conservative place, to deliberate together in small groups about climate change, about same-sex unions, and about affirmative action. We recorded their views before they started to talk, anonymously. We had them deliberate to a group verdict on those three issues to figure out what they thought as a group, and then to figure out what they thought, to ask them to speak anonymously about their views after deliberation. Now, while we were doing this in a conservative area, Colorado Springs, we were doing exactly the same thing in a liberal area, Boulder, on the three issues: climate change, affirmative action, same-sex unions. What do you think would happen when the Colorado people talked with one another in conservative groups and also in liberal groups? Okay, here's what happened. The people in Colorado Springs started out pretty conservative on the three issues, but also there was a degree of diversity on the issues. After they talked to one another in their private anonymous statements of view, they ended up much more extreme and much more cohesive on all three issues. So while they were skeptical about affirmative action and climate change before they started to talk, after they started to talk, they really disliked affirmative action, and they thought climate change should not be addressed through an international agreement. With the liberals in Boulder, Colorado, exactly the same thing happened. As they started to talk with one another, they became more extreme in their commitments, more confident, and more unified. So what happened, and this was a surprise to me, I confess, is that while the people in Boulder and the people in Colorado Springs were, on average, not that far off before they started to talk, after their internal discussions among like-minded people, Colorado Springs went way to the right, Boulder way to the left, and the groups were very far apart. Now, I think that is a microcosm, really, for what is happening, at least in some parts of the social media and the United States, every hour of every day, where like-minded people speaking with one another end up more cohesive, more confident, and more extreme as a result of their internal discussions. So that's one avenue into this. Another avenue into this is that the issue of conspiracy theories, and I'll say a little bit about this as we go on, is not only of interest in its own right, it tells us something about the formation of beliefs, political and otherwise, in general. So if you take false conspiracy theories, and of course a number of them are true, but if you take false ones, and you wonder, why do people believe these theories when they are intelligent and mentally stable? You can have an inroad into the formation of beliefs generally. And to get a little bit ahead of the story, many of the things we believe, in fact, most of the things we believe, we lack direct sensory knowledge of. We know that our house looks a certain way, and we know that our family members are a certain way. We know those things for sure, but whether George Washington existed, whether the Earth is round, whether Mars is real, these are things which we don't have at least direct sensory knowledge of. We know, and we do know them as much as we know most things, because of credible reports from people whom we trust. And that is human life, isn't it? And belief and disbelief in conspiracy theories has a lot to do with that, I'll be suggesting. Okay, this book has turned out to be more timely than I anticipated. Conspiracy theories are indeed all around us. A poll in 2013 found that a significant percentage of people in the United States believe that climate change is a hoax and a product of the thinking of conspiracy-minded types. Significant numbers of people all over the world believe that the 9/11 attacks were done by the United States or by Israel. We can think of examples involving prominent political figures in the United States, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, where hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people believe that they are behind or associated with some terrible conspiracy. Okay, where do conspiracy theories come from? It's tempting, and now I'm going to turn to the text if you would, so I make at least fewer errors than I otherwise would. It's tempting to think that the conspiracy theories come from some sort of emotional or other difficulty, maybe a lack of education, maybe some kind of individual pathology. That's not really right. We don't have a lot of evidence for that. We do find, however, that there are differences in people's propensity to accept conspiracy theories. So the first point to emphasize is that some people are conspiracists and others aren't, and probably a little internal introspection can give you a quick signal about which one you are. In fact, the best predictor of whether a given person is going to accept a conspiracy theory is whether they accept other conspiracy theories. People who think that the FBI killed Martin Luther King are especially likely to think that climate change is a hoax. More striking, research suggests that the tendency even extends to beliefs in mutually contradictory conspiracy theories, so that those who believe that Princess Diana faked her own death are also more likely to believe that she was murdered. Those who believe that John Kennedy fell victim to an organized conspiracy are also more likely to believe there was a conspiracy behind the success of the Red Bull energy drink. A conspiracy theory that was invented purposely for the purpose of a social psychology study. So we do know that there are conspiracist tendencies, but putting that to one side, I think we need to get away from individual psychology and instead to how information travels. There's a brilliant paper from a few years ago by a psychologist named Russell Hardin with a fancy name for a simple concept, I think. The name is the Crippled Epistemology of Extremism. And what Hardin urges is that when people know things that are false and extreme, it's often because their epistemology, their knowledge base, is crippled, because everything they've heard goes in one direction and it's wrong. So when people hold extremist beliefs, Hardin urges, and the extremist beliefs aren't consistent with reality, it's because they're subject to an information flow which drives them in a not-so-good direction. Now turn, if you would, to the study with which I began, our Colorado study involving climate change, same-sex relations, and affirmative action, and kind of give that a conspiracy theory twist, and ask why is it that intelligent people who don't have a particular propensity to believe conspiracy theories will end up thinking something that's false and that puts a spotlight on actors who conspired together to make something terrible happen. Okay, they are often subject to this phenomenon of group polarization, which is what happened in Colorado, which itself has two mechanisms behind it. In Boulder, what happened was the liberals talking with one another were hearing a lot of things about the scariness of climate change and the necessity for affirmative action. Now, bracket the question whether what they were hearing was justified or not. There was an informational skew in the pool of points that they were subject to. Yes? By definition. This was a liberal group, so they were going to be hearing a lot of liberal arguments. So too in Colorado Springs, there was an informational skew in the sense that they were hearing a lot of points about why same-sex unions weren't a very good idea, potentially dangerous, and a lot of things about the evils of affirmative action. If they're listening to one another, and human beings do, then they will pick up on those arguments, and those arguments are going to move them in a direction that's more extreme. Now, if we give this a twist to think of whether climate change is a hoax, whether the 9/11 attacks actually happened, whether in some nation that's unfriendly to the United States, it's accurate to think that their unfriendliness is justified. If there's an initial disposition to think those things, they're going to be hearing a lot of arguments in favor of that position, and that will naturally move them in the direction of more extreme belief. Yes? So this is basically an informational account of how conspiracy theories spread. I want to add 2 wrinkles to the informational account, which is about group polarization, how people move toward a more extreme point in line with their initial tendency. And the first of these has to do with people's concern for their own reputation. If you're in a group of people who are interacting with one another, especially in person, but potentially online also, you want to have a good reputation. You want them to think well of you. And if the position in the group is pushing hard in direction of hostility toward powerful actors, let's say, that suggesting agreement with that dominant tendency is going to be consistent with your reputational concern, and putting pressure on the dominant opinion in the group is going to weaken your position within the group, won't it? So even if your concern is in part for truth, your presentation of what you think will be skewed by your concern for your own reputation. Now, there's a kind of psychological kicker here that I think puts the reputational point in bold letters. Here's the point. If you're talking to someone and they agree with you, you will typically think that they are more likable and more intelligent than you did before they agreed with you. There's another that's a little more devastating, I think, about the potential consequences of social interaction. That is, if that person agrees with you, not only do you think that they're more likable and intelligent than you did before, you think that you yourself are more intelligent and likable than you did before. Now that suggests that the social interaction, in person and online, can push people in direction of agreement with a dominant tendency with a group, even if their initial disposition is skeptical, and it can lead a group toward commitment to conspiracist thinking. Okay, here's the third point behind the group polarization phenomenon that I'm describing. Within any interaction, if people are asked their opinion on some issue that's technical and complicated, whether it's what brought down an airliner or what nation is responsible for what bad thing, they will often speak, if they're not specialists, with a degree of tentativeness. They'll move to humility. Now suppose within that group, their initial tendency is corroborated by the agreement of seemingly credible others. Their caution is softened by virtue of the fact of corroboration. And that weakens the moderating force of humility, thus leading people towards greater extremism. So my first suggestion is that conspiracist thinking often is heightened as a result of the group polarization phenomenon that we saw in Boulder and Colorado Springs and all over the world when people are developing a commitment to a belief that actually lacks credibility. It's because objective credibility. It's because like-minded people are talking to one another and stirring each other up. Okay, there's another phenomenon that is related but distinct, and it also has a kind of complicated name. The name is an informational cascade. And here's how the idea works. Suppose you have a group of people who are talking with one another, and they're in a kind of temporal queue, that is, they're speaking in sequence. And let's suppose that the first person in the group suggests a commitment to some fact. Let's say that there's a hoax behind conspiracy theory or that some terrible deed was done by the United Kingdom. The second person in the queue then has a choice. Do you agree with the person or not? Now, if the second person in the queue, and I'm hoping this is mapping on to political or other discussions that are kind of familiar from everyday life, the second person in the queue will think either I'm going to agree with that person or I'm not. And if the person doesn't really know the truth, that is, the person is either in equipoise or just facing the issue for the first time, the likelihood is that the person will find that original statement credible enough to justify assent. And then we have two people in a temporal queue who are agreeing that the United Kingdom is responsible for something terrible. Then there's a third person, and this is a stylized example of what happens all the time, a third person in the queue who's confronted with a unified view of, let's say, Albert and Barbara, which is accusing the United Kingdom of something terrible. The third person now has some informational pressure on his back, doesn't he? That Albert and Barbara both think this thing, and then this third person, Charles, will have to either have courage or knowledge to justify disagreement with them. And if they're in a group that has some sort of dynamic, such that Charles has to say whether he agrees with Albert and Barbara, chances are, under not unreasonable assumptions, that Charles will rationally say, I think that too. And we actually know that this happens from studies of jury behavior, where a third juror in a queue who has said privately, I think the defendant is innocent, will sometimes say, when the Albert and Barbara have said guilty, guilty. And then when asked, why do you think that afterwards, the person who switched his view simply by virtue of having heard the first two speakers will say it's obvious, guilty, even though his own independent judgment was otherwise. Now, once you have three people in the queue, A, B, and C, all saying that the United Kingdom is responsible for something terrible, then a third person, Douglas, say, is under a lot of informational pressure to self-silence. The informational cascade is often responsible for the rise of conspiracy theories, especially when there's someone, let's call it a conspiracy entrepreneur, who has started the conspiracy either because of some ideological commitment or because of some personal goal, which may be fame or attention. Then you can get something going like crazy. Okay, if you followed me on group polarization, the Colorado Springs Boulder study, which I'm mapping onto the conspiracy theory situation, I think you'll be able to see that the informational cascade that I've described has a sibling, which is the reputational cascade. And it looks very similar to the informational cascade, except that the Barbers and Charleses and Douglases of the world are responding not to their own belief that the earlier speakers were right, but are responding to their own fear that if they don't speak out in agreement with the emerging wisdom, so to speak, of the group, they will face some sort of reputational sanction, which at the modest point would be a little more dislike. At the less modest point would be actual physical threat, which often happens in groups that have conspiracy theories which are most dangerous and threatening to the United States. In those groups, the third and fourth and fifth speakers or actors in a queue self-silence, not because they actually agree or speak out in accord with the conspiracy theory, not because they have much of a inside their heads commitment to it, but because their personal risks are severe. Okay, so now we have group polarization as an explanatory factor. We have informational cascades as an explanatory factor, and we have reputational cascades as an explanatory factor, all parasitic on the understanding that some people have conspiracist predispositions, just a fact. Okay, I want to mention just one further point by way of getting the mechanisms out, maybe one and a half. Okay, the full one point has to do with a psychological mechanism which helped get Daniel Kahneman the Nobel Prize in 2002. And it's called the Availability Heuristic, which is also maybe too jargony to be ideal. But the notion is, if people are asked to make a probability judgment, they often focus on whether an event readily comes to mind. So if you're asked how many words on a random page have as the last three letters ing, you might well say a large number, because it's easy to think of ing ending words. If you're asked how many words on a random page have as the second to last letter n, you might not say that many. A lot of people don't say that many because it's a little cognitively trickier to come up with words that have as the second last letter n. So some people will say more ing words on a random page than n, though that can't be true, right? Every ing word is a second to last letter n word, and there are plenty others, of which one is and itself. Okay, that's ing words are available. Now, more people tend to think that more people die of homicide than suicide. The opposite is true. It's because homicide deaths are cognitively available, suicide deaths typically less so. And availability can lead our minds astray by making for probability judgments that aren't quite right. And the salience of a widely publicized event can kind of drive the mind in particular directions. Okay, what I want to suggest here is that conspiracy theories are often building on the availability heuristic, meaning a salient event which triggers either confusion or outrage or fear, and whose outlet is a conspiracy theory. So if you have something terrible that's happened, either through human action or through random events, then the fixation on that thing needs an outlet, which is often an explanation. And that can initiate the process of informational or reputational cascades. A little footnote referring to the fact that often the terrible events that generate conspiracy theories really do have a randomness behind them. The author of a book called, a graphic novel called Watchmen, named Alan Moore. Those of you who are graphic novel fans will know this as an iconic book. And Alan Moore is the kind of genius of the modern era of graphic novels. And he's not, I think one wouldn't describe him as a member of the establishment. That's not how you describe him. He's himself iconoclastic in multiple ways. And he apparently spent a few years studying conspiracy theories, and which you might think, given his imagination, he'd be drawn to. And his conclusion was that the conspiracy theories just aren't right. I'm going to put it less eloquently than he did, because conspiracy theories miss the extent of randomness and coincidence in the world, which often drives events. Okay, so there's availability, meaning events, which trigger conspiracy thinking. And now I'll give you the half of the final little bit of conspiracy theories. I've tried to attribute conspiracy thinking to information flows and reputational concerns within groups. But how do groups form, and why don't they have the requisite diversity? Okay, one reason often is a leader who is imposing social sanctions on people who depart from the group's orthodoxy. That's clear. But one reason also has to do with selection in and selection out. So as you get people selected into groups, particularly dangerous groups, but also groups that are harmless but obsessed, there are people who are filtering into groups and people who are selected out of groups either through their own volition or involuntarily because they are in some respect infidels. And that suggests that the process of group polarization, which is most intense if like-minded people are talking to one another, has a natural fuel, which is the process of selection in and selection out. As people who are skeptics or unsure leave the group, then the social influences that move the group toward more extremism are heightened, aren't they? Because the people who aren't sure aren't there anymore. And that creates like a tight knot of believers. Okay, a couple qualifications and then a concluding note. I haven't said anything about what should be done about conspiracy theories. The greatest safeguard against false conspiracy theories is an open and democratic nation. So there's something perfect about delivering these remarks at the National Archives, insofar as there are open processes and requirements of transparency. Then the informational base for conspiracy theories that are false is severely compromised, which is why you see often in societies that are authoritarian and unfree, where openness isn't allowed, a kind of flowering of conspiracy theories, not at all from crazy people, but from people who rightly can't trust their government and don't know what's true, and develop a theory which is not less plausible than a range of other theories just because they don't have an informational base on which to build. So the remedy number one for the rise of false conspiracy theories has its roots in our First Amendment and the panoply of liberties that the First Amendment is associated with. The other point is I haven't said anything about particular conspiracy theories. So I don't mean to say that any particular one is right or wrong. I have my views on some of those, but that is independent of the theory of the paper. Okay, a few closing words. Here you go. These are the closing words of this particular chapter. Some people have a propensity to accept conspiracy theories as reflected in the finding that people who tend to believe one are likely to believe in another, even if the two are in direct contradiction. Many people who accept conspiracy theories, at least if they're false, suffer from a crippled epistemology. Their beliefs are a function of what they hear, which is a way of saying they are fully rational. They are responsive to what they're hearing. For that reason, isolated social networks are breeding grounds for conspiracy theories. In some cases, the theories help to fuel violence all over the world, and we are seeing it. To reduce the risk, it's indispensable first to understand how those theories arise and why perfectly reasonable people, not in any deep sense different from others, come to hold them even if they're palpably false. Conspiracy theories that are false are, of course, an extreme case, but an understanding of the mechanisms that lie behind them helps shed light on the formation of political beliefs in general and on why some of those beliefs go wrong. Thanks. So questions and comments.
So my name's Jim Lowen. I wrote a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is an analysis of American history textbooks. And I've read more of them than any other living person. A stupid
Bless
career
you.
choice.
Bless you.
And I suggest to you, I got a suggestion and then I have a question. My suggestion is that our high school history textbooks are a good petri dish to breed conspiracy thinking, because they pretty much eschew any discussion of causation. And so things just kind of happen one after another, and certainly the government is never responsible for anything bad, and therefore there's no solid thinking that goes on in response to these textbooks. And social studies and history in high school they're always the least liked course in every survey in the country, and they seem to have no relevance to the present, and they have no corrective influence, therefore, toward the kind of thinking that might dispel untoward acceptance of conspiracy theories. Just something for you to think about. My question is, isn't the unqualified rejection of conspiracy theories just as simple-minded as their unqualified acceptance? And this gets to then, aren't there at least a couple of conspiracy theories that we all should be thinking about seriously and maybe believing?
Well, I don't know if I'd say equivalence, but I do agree that an unqualified rejection of conspiracy theories would be evidence-free thinking. So everything depends on evidence. Watergate was a conspiracy. So it would be
that's an easy one because we accept that. But I submit that a couple of ones that we don't accept as a nation, at least as a government, such as perhaps the single-person murder of Kennedy followed by the single-person murder of Oswald, or the single-person murder of Martin Luther King followed by that person from rural Arkansas's successful emigration to England and Belgium and so on, that those are maybe things that we all should be thinking about.
I want to bracket the particular ones, but say something that bears on your obvious knowledge of at least some of the examples you described. One thing I've noticed that's been fascinating to me in talking about this book is that the people who believe in conspiracy theories, whether or not they're warranted in the facts, so we're bracketing that, tend to be extremely knowledgeable. They are information rich. Mm-hmm. So the people who've come to me with, let's say, plausible conspiracy theories and also truly bizarre conspiracy theories, they have a lot of information. So to argue, for anyone in this room to argue with them on the merits would be challenging. Not just because they're zealous. In fact, not mostly because they're zealous, because they know so much. And that's connected, isn't it, with the thesis about the rise of conspiracy theories. So the focus of the remarks were on false conspiracy theories and how they arise, but of course there are true ones. I mean, some of the worst events in the 20th century are associated with conspiracy theories that are rooted in something that actually happened.
I'm going to leave, but I do feel a little bit strange for being dismissed for having known too much. But that's
no, I didn't. I apologize if that was the. I wasn't talking about you in particular, and I tried to emphasize that you're right. Some conspiracy theories are true, and people who propagate them, the true ones, they know a lot.
Well, you know, I have to borrow from your talk this morning when you said conspiracy theories which are dangerous or threatening to the United States. You once co-authored a paper in which you advocated infiltrating the 9/11 truth movement. And as you stated correctly, there are thousands of people in this country and around the world, many thousands, who don't believe the official story of what happened on September 11th. Even the 9/11 Commission stated that they were misled by the government. My question to you is, do you still believe what you stated there? And to me, it's difficult to understand how you could, in your book, Why Societies Need Dissent, and yet you called for the need to infiltrate the 9/11 truth movement. Did you, while you were in the government, the Obama administration, did you endeavor to carry out that effort?
Okay, so none of the academic writing I did on these topics had any connection with my work in the government. So my work in the government was on openness and transparency in part. It was a lot on paperwork reduction, and it was a lot on cost-benefit analysis. So that was my work in government. This sort of thing was not related. These issues we're now discussing not related in any way. I'll tell you what I think about the question you raise. The term my co-author and I used, and it's in this book also, cognitive infiltration, is not one I'm really excited about. I don't think it was a happy term, but the idea is more innocuous, I think, than some readers have understood it. The way I understood it as in this book and in the article is, if you have people outside the United States, and that's the focus, who are threatening to kill us, who believe things that are false and dangerous, then it's appropriate, just as it is domestically, to correct the record, either by having the United States itself directly correct the record, or by the United States working with people in those countries who know the truth and who correct the record. So what Justice Brandeis said in context of our First Amendment law was the remedy for falsehood is more speech, not enforced silence. And the idea basically is more speech in isolated social networks. They're getting very stirred up in a way that's potentially damaging to the United States. Now this, as I say, this idea is has zero relationship to my Paperwork Reduction Act, cost-benefit analysis job in the government. But the idea is a natural outgrowth of the claim that when people in a nation, and you can take your pick, are actually dangerous to the United States, but they're often young people who are being stirred in most unfortunate directions for them and for their people in their country. It's a good idea to help them see that what they're being told isn't actually true. And if you look at some of the threats the United States is facing now, and this is taking me afield from my areas of expertise, but some of the threats that the United States is facing now, to try to make sure that the threat doesn't grow. And when it grows often on the basis not only of intense emotions, but also of false beliefs about our nation. That's to cultivate friends rather than enemies, to try to turn the latter into the former. That's one of the things that free nations make themselves safer by doing.
I would simply add that it's really become clear to myself and many others that the official story, whether it's this government or other governments, the official story of vast number of key events in our history always turn out to be false.
I think they can't always turn out to be false. It can't be that.
You will agree they often turn out to be false.
Well, I wouldn't. I think on 9/11, I don't think what you think, but they sometimes turn out to be false, which is one reason why freedom of speech is essential, and openness and transparency are safeguards against false conspiracy theories, and they also are, and I think you'll find this congenial, they're ways of bringing to light conspiracy theories that actually turn out to be true. In Watergate, a free press, system of free speech was indispensable.
Thank you.
Question about wisdom of crowds. That how does that sort of compare with your more specific look at conspiracy? And does the whole discussion of the wisdom of crowds sort of give a patina of acceptability because you now have a group saying, we're our group and we believe this, and there's so many of us and we must be right?
Okay, fantastic question. So if we asked a large group of people how much I weigh, the average answer is going to be extremely accurate. That's just kind of an apparently magical truth about crowds. And one reason Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the old TV show, which I gather is going to be a new TV show, why, if you ask the studio audience, I guess what it thinks, the plurality answer, the majority answer is scary good. Even though when you call your lifeline, who's often like your expert friend, it's not scary good. It's pretty good. Now, what's going on there? And this is directly responsive to the question. There's some old arithmetic done by a social theorist named Condorcet, who said if you take a group of people whose average member is more likely to be right than wrong, the likelihood that the majority of the group will be right grows to 100% as the group gets bigger. So if you take 5 people and the average member is more likely to be right than wrong, the likelihood that the majority was right is going to get arithmetically higher as that group expands from 5 to 10 to 50 to 100. And by the time they're at 50,000, if each of them is 70% likely to be right, the likelihood that the majority is going to be right, it gets really, really high. And that's the kind of mechanism. That's the core of the mechanism behind the wisdom of crowds. But what Condorcet, the French theorist, noted was if the average member of the group is more likely to be wrong than right, then the answer flips. Then the likelihood that the crowd gets it wrong expands to 100% as the group gets bigger. So the wisdom of crowds depends on a number of conditions, one of which is that there be either a majority or plurality of correctness in the group at the beginning, and also that their judgments are independent. So the mechanisms I was describing are ones of social interaction, which can move people in not good directions. And once those social interactions are occurring, we're outside of the wisdom of crowds framework. We're into something else. And if the group members have a predisposition to be wrong, then the whole account falls apart. It's in the mirror. So if you have a group of people who are likely to make a mistake about whether Abraham Lincoln was the X number president or the Y number president, then the group is just going to get it wrong. So the words "the wisdom of crowds" it's a very gripping term, but it's misleading because the mechanism behind crowd wisdom works only on the basis of specified assumptions.
On? I can't tell.
Yeah.
So I wanted to come back to something that you said at the very beginning. That is, we believe that Washington existed or that Mars is there based on authority. And I would like to say that my feeling now is that there is tremendous cynicism about authority. I'm a physician scientist, and I can tell you over and over again, I hear people with real knowledge and authority speaking out on a subject, and then I hear people who've searched the internet speaking out on the subject. And when the arguments are presented in public, the person who has internet credentials is given as much credence as somebody who spent their life studying the subject. And people do not respect authority anymore the way they used to. And I think this has a huge impact on the development of conspiracy ideas. They feed on ignorance.
Okay, well, there's a lot there. So there's undoubtedly considerable truth in it, and let me underline where I'm sure you're right. As you talk about science and physicians, think about vaccinations, where a number of people think, inconsistent with what I understand to be the body of evidence, that certain vaccines are very risky to take when it's more risky not to take them, and they're not trusting the science. So that's a point. Here's another point for you. If people believe something very firmly, and then they are given an apparently credible correction by a source that really should have authority, not infrequently they will become more committed to their original belief. So this is the case of the backfiring correction, where if you put people's deeply held beliefs under grave pressure, not infrequently their response will not be to say, oh, maybe I'm wrong, but instead to believe it even more firmly. And you can think of why this might be. It might be because of emotional intensification when your identity in a way is on the line, or it could be not emotional. You just think, why would they deny it if it's not true? Which is in some circumstances a reasonable thing to say, and in some cases kind of wild. So that's completely right. What I don't know is whether the level of trust in scientific authority, for example, is lower than it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago. So that's a scientific question, yes? And I just don't know the science on it. It is undoubtedly true that the internet has the beautiful feature that you can find out what the experts think in a minute, but you can also find out what apparent experts think, not a minute, a second. You can find out what apparent experts think in the same second, and you can see maybe some apparently credible person disagreeing with another apparently credible person, and then I think that's what you're capturing. And from the standpoint of the disbeliever and, let's say, the true authority, probably they are, in many cases, just being rational, given what they know. So it's very connected with the account I'm giving of conspiracy theories. They're not experts in some scientific question, and then they read this and they read that, and both seem good, and it may be that their prior commitment or something that is emotionally satisfying. And it can be, the priors are so important to whether things are credible or not, where your prior belief before you read the stuff, where it might be either, you just have a judgment where one is consistent with it and the other isn't, and of course you're going to believe the thing that's consistent, or one is emotionally calming or energizing, and calm and energizing are both good, and the other is disturbing or makes you feel tired. You don't like either of those, if you're with me. So you go with the calming and the energizing rather than the disturbing and tiring. And that's more a motivated response. And you're undoubtedly right. Now, what I don't know, is the trend lines on these things. And it is true that we can think of cases, vaccination is one, where among a non-trivial percentage of our fellow citizens, the belief in the scientific experts is weak. And whether it's an anecdote or a generalized distrust that's driving their disbelief, that one's literally dangerous, not in the same sense that we were discussing with people who want to do harm to Americans, but they're not protecting their children. Yeah.
Well, your academic analysis is impressive, but it's where analysis meets policy that is really important. And we've lost trust in this country. All the polls show that people trust government less and less all the time. And I ask, what are conspiracy theories? Who is in danger by, for example, a quest by a conspiracy theory group for the truth, when secrecy has become standard to the far greater extent than ever before in government? And so when prior to your becoming engaged in policy, you had written this statement that it was a good idea to infiltrate, and disrupt perfectly legal groups that were seeking the truth in a time when cover-ups were self-evident. I mean, there was no investigation, and as a matter of fact, the brakes were put on an investigation of 9/11 for 14 months. Until the widows forced the door open. And then they tried to put Kissinger in, a known war criminal who had to get out of it because...
What did they try to put Kissinger in?
As the head of the 9/11 Commission, before they put Zelikow, a known administration ally, in as the head of it. So, yes, we've lost trust, and so we come up with theories as to what really happened because secrets are being kept. Now, you were then put into a policy position on on the information and regulatory affairs thing. Information is critical, right? And yet information is what has been hidden, and disruption of perfectly good groups looking for information and truth was something that you proposed. Is it true that you're on the board or related to the NSA in some way? No, I just recently read that.
I was on the President's Review Group on the surveillance, where we did a report which is publicly available.
Okay, so, I mean, you know what we all think about the NSA these days. Not a great deal of credibility there and a lot of secrecy. So, I'm kind of upset about your thing.
I hear you didn't like my previous article so much.
Yeah, well, I'm skeptical of your whole, the idea that conspiracies are dangerous. Conspiracy theories are dangerous. The question is to who? To the status quo, to the current situation, which is imperialist, which is militaristic, all over the world, including in Gaza. I mean, we look at this stuff and we say, who are these people that are ruling us?
Okay, so the probably most important thing about American democracy is freedom of speech. So, the kind of democratic thrust of your question, I completely endorse. In terms of what the concrete concern is, I think your concrete concern is secrecy. And I wouldn't say what you did about there being more secrecy now than ever. I'm not sure there's a metric in accordance with which that's true. But the idea that there should be less secrecy in important areas than there has been, completely with you on that. And if you read the report of the NSA Review Group, I was one of 5 members, that's actually a principal theme. So there's a big plea for much more disclosure of much more stuff in that context than there had been before. So the connection between suspicion and secrecy, you're completely right on that. Okay, one more? One more because of time, not because of sensitivity.
Yes. Now, on this whole internet thing and Google and everything else, what is your opinion? Does this enormous amount of information that's available to all of us, does that lead to either more conspiracy theories or less because of all the openness and all the information?
I don't think we have data on that. Probably a reasonable speculation is that false conspiracy theories, and I think that's what you're thinking of, false conspiracy theories are more readily corrected, and so a number of people who would be prone to believe them just don't, whereas false conspiracy theories are available and people who are prone to believe them can find evidentiary base. So I don't want to speculate without the data. I do want to underline the point the previous questioner asked, which is it isn't right to say conspiracy theories are dangerous, period. That would not be true. Conspiracy theories can be dangerous if they are part and parcel of a effort to protect in quotes, kids from getting medicines that they need, or if they're part of an effort to stir people up to violent acts. On the trend lines with respect to the internet, I think we're going to know a lot more in the next 5 years, both because we'll have more data and we studied better. But the great promise is that corrections are easy to get. But there are credulous people who won't believe the corrections. I think I'm being given the signal to thank you all. And thanks for coming.